and welcome to my channel. Today is Monday and it's time for True Crime and Makeup Monday. So today we're going to be talking about the Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, also known as the Andes Flight Disaster, which I realize is not really true crime, but it's an interesting story. And because I've been watching Yellow Jackets, I was like, this is what I want to do my story on. So without further ado, let's get into it. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 was the chartered flight of a Fairchild FH 227D from Montevideo, Uruguay to Santiago, Chile, that crashed in the Andes Mountain on October 31st, 1972. The accident and subsequent survival became known as the Andes Flight Disaster and the Miracle of the Andes. The inexperienced co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector LaGuardia, was the pilot flying at the time of the accident. He mistakenly believed the aircraft had overflown Curacao, the turning point to fly north and begin descending into Pujehil Airport in Santiago de Chile, but failed to notice that instrument readings indicated he was still 60 to 70 kilometers east of Curacao. As the aircraft began its descent, it struck a mountain ridge, which is not the actual mountain, but the ledge of the mountain, shearing off both wings and the tail cone. The remaining portion of the fuselage slid down a glacier at an estimated 350 kilometers per hour, 220 miles per hour, and descended another 725 meters before ramming into an ice and snow mound. The flight was carrying 45 passengers and crew, including 19 members of the Old Christians Club Rugby Union team, along with their families, supporters, and friends. These three crew members and 9 passengers died immediately, and several more died soon after due to the frigid temperatures and the severity of their injuries. The crash site is located at an elevation of 3,570 meters in the remote Andes Mountains of western Argentina, just east of the border with Chile. Authorities overflew the crash site several times during the following days, searching for the aircraft, but failed to make out the white fuselage against the snow. Search efforts were called off after 8 days of searching. So, from what I understand, they were assuming that everybody had died in the crash. And, basically that, they were just recovering bodies. So they were like, we can do that anytime. We don't have to do that now. Sadly, there was still people alive. During 72 days after the crash, survivors suffered from extreme hardships, including exposure, starvation, and several avalanches. If you've never been in an avalanche, or you've never seen an avalanche on TV, that's a lot of snow. And it's coming fast and it's coming hard, and there's not really a lot you can do. There's really nothing you can do to stop it, which led to the deaths of 13 more passengers. The remaining passengers resorted to cannibalism to survive. And I know we're all thinking Jeffrey Dahmer, but this was literally survival cannibalism. They weren't just eating people to eat people. And they tried to just kind of do without it. But like I said, 72 days and they were slowly starving to death. So, well, I'm not saying go eat your friends. I'm also saying we can't really judge them because we don't know what we would have done in that situation. As the weather improved with the arrival of late spring, 2 survivors, Nando Parado and Robert Sinessa, climbed the 4,650 meter mountain peak on the western rim of the glacier, without any mountaineering gear whatsoever and hiked for 10 days into Chile to seek help, traveling 61 kilometers, 38 miles. On December 23rd, 1972, 2 months after the crash, all 16 remaining survivors were rescued. The news of their miraculous survival drew worldwide headlines and evolved into a media circus, which, I mean, makes sense. These people were missing and presumed dead. And in reality, there's 16 living, breathing people that survived. Members of the amateur Old Christians Club rugby union team from Montevideo, Uruguay, were scheduled to play a match in Santiago, Chile. Needless to say, they did not make it. Against the Old Boys Club, an English rugby team. Club president Daniel Juan chartered a Uruguayan Air Force twin turboprop Fairchild FH-227D airplane to fly the team over the Andes Mountains to Santiago. The aircraft carried 40 passengers and 5 crew members. The pilot in command, Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas, was an experienced Air Force pilot with 5,117 hours of flight time. He was accompanied by co-pilot Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector LaGuardia. There were 10 extra seats, so the team invited friends and family members to accompany them. When someone canceled at the last minute, Graciela Mariani purchased a ticket so she could attend her oldest daughter's wedding. The aircraft departed Carrasco International Airport on October 12th, 1972, but a storm front over the Andes forced them to spend the night in Mendoza, Argentina, to wait for meteorological conditions to improve. They should have waited longer. Although there is a direct westerly route from Mendoza to Santiago, the high mountains with peaks of 25,000 to 26,000 feet were almost at the limit of the FH-227D's maximum operational ceiling of 28,000 feet. With the aircraft loaded to capacity, this direct route would have required the pilot to thread the aircraft very carefully to avoid the mountains. Instead, it was customary for turboprops to fly the longer 600-kilometer, 90-minute U-shaped route to Malargüe, south of Mendoza, using the A7 airway. Then west along the G17 airway, crossing Planchon Pass and on to the Curacao radio beacon in Chile, and from there due north to descend and land in Santiago. The weather on October 13th affected the flight adversely. On the morning of the flight, meteorological conditions over the Andes had yet to improve, but the weather was expected to improve by the early afternoon. The pilot delayed the flight and took off from Mendoza at 2:18 p.m. on Friday, October 13th. He flew south towards the Malargüe radio beacon at flight level 180. LaGuardia radioed their position to Malargüe Airport to inform them they expected crossing the 2,515 meters high Planchon Pass at 3:21 p.m. Planchon Pass is the air traffic control handoff point between Chile and Argentina. After crossing the Andes into Chile, the aircraft was supposed to turn north and initiate their descent into Ciudad Hall Airport in Santiago. Pilot Ferradas had previously flown across the Andes 29 times. On this flight, he was training co-pilot LaGuardia, who was at the controls. As they flew above the Andes, clouds obscured the mountains below. The aircraft was 4 years old with 792 hours on the airframe. The plane was nicknamed the Lead Sled by pilots because they considered it underpowered. Due to cloud cover, the pilots were flying under instrument meteorological conditions at an altitude of 18,000 feet and could not visually confirm their location from the terrain below. While some reports state the co-pilot incorrectly estimated his position using dead reckoning, he was relying on radio navigation. The aircraft's VOR-DME navigation radio would have shown the bearing and distance to the Curacao radio beacon, still 60 to 70 kilometers due west of Planchon Pass. At 3:21 p.m., shortly after crossing Planchon Pass, LaGuardia noticed air traffic controllers that he expected to reach Curacao a minute later. The flight time from Planchon Pass to Curacao was normally 11 minutes, but only 3 minutes later, the co-pilot radioed Santiago that they were overflying Curacao and turning due north. He requested permission from air traffic control to descend. The controller authorized the aircraft to descend to 11,000 feet, unaware due to lack of radar coverage that the airplane was still flying over the Andes. The aircraft encountered severe turbulence as it descended. Nando Parado recalled that the plane rapidly descended several hundred feet out of the clouds. At first, the rugby players joked about the turbulence until they saw the aircraft was flying abnormally close to the mountains. That was probably the moment when the pilot saw the Black Ridge rising dead ahead. Roberto Canessa later said he thought the pilot had turned due north too soon and began the descent to Santiago while the aircraft was still flying over the Andes. Then he began to climb until the plane was nearly vertical and it began to stall and shake. The aircraft's ground collision alarm sounded and scared all the passengers. The co-pilot applied maximum power to gain altitude and cross the 4,200 meters high southern ridge of the glacier's cirque. Witness accounts and evidence at the scene indicated the plane struck the mountain 2 or 3 different times. At 3:34 p.m., while the nose of the aircraft made it over the ridge, the tail cone clipped the ridge and separated from the fuselage. The right wing was severed from the fuselage as well. As the tail cone detached, it took the rear section of the fuselage with it, along with 2 rows of seats, the galley, baggage hold, vertical stabilizer, and horizontal stabilizer, leaving a gaping hole in the rear of the fuselage. 3 passengers, the navigator, and the flight attendant were lost with the tail section and died instantly. The aircraft continued forward and up another 200 meters for a few more seconds until a rock outcropping at 4,400 meters tore off the left wing and its propeller sliced through the fuselage. 2 more passengers fell out of the rear of the fuselage. The fuselage flew straight through the air before falling onto the snow and proceeded to careen 725 meters down the steep slope of the glacier at 350 kilometers per hour like a high-speed bobsled. The fuselage rammed into a snowbank and came to a sudden stop. The seats broke loose from the floor and were thrown against the forward bulkhead of the fuselage. So the seats literally came undone and slammed into the front of the plane. So this would be hitting obviously the cockpit. The impact buckled the nose, pinning both pilots against the instrument panel, killing Ferraris immediately. So only 1 pilot died out the gate. But you gotta imagine. So it was like several rows of seats. So when it hit the front of the plane, immediately the cockpit was done. There was no saving that. But you have to imagine that all the seats behind them were also against it. So I don't know how passengers managed to get out of that one without any harm, but they did, and the only one killed at that moment was Ferraris. The official investigation concluded that the crash was caused by controlled flight into terrain due to pilot error. The plane's fuselage came to rest in the cirque of the until then named Glacier of Tears at an elevation of 3,570 meters in the Malague Department's Valley of Tears and the Mendoza province of Argentina. The glacier lies between 5,169 meters. High of Mount Sosiniato and the 4,280 meters high Tinguerca volcano, straddling the remote mountainous border between Chile and Argentina. It is south of it is south of the 4,650 meters high Mount Sealer, named by Nando Parado after his father. The mountain of the survivors' expedition climbed before descending into Chile to get help. The aircraft came to rest 80 kilometers to the east of its planned route. Of the 45 people aboard the aircraft when it crashed, 3 passengers and 2 crew members in the rear section of the fuselage were killed instantly when the tail cone sheared off. Lieutenant Ramon Sol Martinez, the navigator, Orvido Ramirez, steward Gaston Costamale, Alejo Shuni, and Guido Magari. I know I'm probably not doing well with these names. I'm so sorry. Please bear with me. I really am sorry if I got these wrong. A few seconds later, Daniel Shaw and Carlos Valletta also fell out of the rear fuselage, killing Shaw immediately. Valletta survived the fall, but fell into deep snow and asphyxiated while stumbling down the... Valletta survived the fall, but fell into deep snow and asphyxiated while stumbling down the snow-covered glacier. His body was found by fellow passengers on December 14th. Another 4 passengers died after the fuselage impacted the snowbank and the remaining seats broke loose from the floor and piled up at the front of the fuselage. Team physician Dr. Francisco Nicola and his wife Esther Nicola, Eugenia Parado, and Fernandez Vasquez, medical student. Pilot Ferradas died instantly when the nose cone of the fuselage and the nose gear deformed as the aircraft came to a sudden stop, pinning him against the instrument panel and forcing his head out of the windshield. Co-pilot LaGuardia was also pinned against the instrument panel and died the following day. He asked for one of the passengers to find his pistol and shoot him, but the passengers refused to do so, which is unfortunate because that means he died a slow, painful death. And I'm not saying you should shoot people. Please don't take that. We're not saying that, YouTube. Like, calm down. But in this situation, and I get it, they were Christians, they were devout Christians, a lot of them. And I get that. But if I were in that situation personally, I would want someone to put me out of my misery. He was dying, and he had to die a slow, painful death because no one would do what he asked them to do. And while I respect their decision to, honor their values and their morals, he ended up eating people. So, at this point, I don't know. I probably would have caved and put him out of his misery because no one needs to die painfully in any situation. And unfortunately, in some cases, it does happen. Cancer patients, all of them, they tend to go painfully. But in this case, they had the power to put this man out of his misery, and they just basically sat there and watched him die slowly, and that was sad. 33 passengers remained alive. Many were critically or seriously injured, with wounds including broken legs from the aircraft seats breaking loose and piling up against the forward bulkhead of the fuselage. Sinessa and Gustavo Zerbino, both medical students, quickly triaged the wounded and first treated those they could help most. Parado's skull had fractured and he remained comatose for 3 days. When a piece of metal piercing Enrique Platerio's abdomen was removed, it brought out a few inches of his stomach with it. Even so, he immediately began helping others. Both of Arturo Naquara's legs were broken in several places. None of the passengers with compound fractures survived. Which, I mean, and that's fair. You're not in a position where you can really, do a whole lot to assist with the conditions that you're in. So, it's fair to say they did the best they could with what they had. And I'm sure there were choices made as to who would survive and who would not. And this is a situation where people who didn't know what to do essentially had to play God. Sad, but it happens. The Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service was notified within the hour that the flight was unaccounted for. 4 planes searched during the afternoon until dark. News of the missing flight reached Uruguayan media around 6 p.m. in the evening. SARS officers listened to official radio transmissions and concluded the aircraft must have crashed in one of the most remote and inaccessible areas of the Andes and asked the Andes Rescue Group of Chile for assistance. Unbeknownst to the passengers on board, or even the rescuers, the flight had crashed in Argentina before even crossing into Chile. So they weren't even in Chile at this moment. About 21 kilometers from the Hotel Termas El Sassonato, an abandoned hot springs resort that would have provided some shelter and warmer temperatures due to the lower altitude. On the second day, 11 aircraft from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay searched for the missing flight. The search area covered the accident location, and a few aircraft even overflew the crash site. The survivors tried to use lipstick recovered from their luggage to write an SOS message on the roof of the fuselage, but didn't have the lipstick to make the letters large enough to be seen by the rescuers from the air. They also used luggage to fashion a cross on the snow, but the cross failed to be spotted by the search and rescue aircraft. The survivors saw aircraft overfly the crash site on 3 occasions, but were unable to get their attention, and none of the aircrafts were able to spot the white fuselage against the snow, which, I mean, fair. The harsh conditions gave the rescue searchers little hope that they would find anyone alive, so rescue efforts were canceled after 8 days of searching. On October 21st, after having searched for more than 142 hours, the searchers concluded that the chances of anyone surviving were nil and terminated the search. Boy, were they wrong. They planned to resume the search to recover the victims in December after the snow had melted. Another 5 passengers and crew died during the first night. The co-pilot LaGuardia, Francisco Abal, Graciela Mariani, Felipe Macquarian, and Julio Martinez Lamas. The 28 surviving passengers removed the broken seats and other debris to fashion the fuselage into a crude shelter. They used seats and snow to close off the rear end of the fuselage. Fito Strauch devised a solar-powered water collector with sheet metal he retrieved from under the seats to prevent snow blindness. So I'm not really sure what that is, but essentially it's just basically like the snow is blinding, and that does happen if the sun is out and the snow is still like strong. I've seen it. I've even experienced it where I'm like, the snow hurts my eyes because it's so bright. But I wasn't 100% sure that that's what it was until I looked it up. And then I was like, yeah, we don't call it that. I don't know what we would call that, but I've never heard it called snow blindness before. He also improvised sunglasses by cutting the green plastic sun visors in the cockpit into pieces and sewing them to bra straps with electrical wire. They used seat covers made of wool to keep warm and sheet cushions as snowshoes. The captain of the rugby team, Marcelo Perez, took on a leadership role. After 3 days, Parado woke from his coma and only to be told his mother had died and his 19-year-old sister Susana was severely injured. He tried to keep his sister alive, but on the 8th day she too died from her injuries. The remaining 27 survivors had a hard time during the nights when temperatures dropped to negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. They had lived their entire lives by the sea, and some had never even seen snow before the crash. None had any high altitude survival experience to speak of. They lacked medical supplies, cold weather clothing, equipment, and food, and they all had only 3 pairs of sunglasses amongst themselves to keep them from going snowblind. The survivors found a small AM transistor radio jammed between 2 aircraft seats. Roy Harley improvised a long antenna using electrical wire from the plane, and on the 11th day on the mountain heard the terrible news that their search had been called off. The survivors had very little food to eat. All told, they managed to scrounge together 8 chocolate bars, 3 small jars of jam, a tin of mussels, a tin of almonds, a few dates, some candy, dried plums, and several bottles of wine. And even though they rationed the food, it only lasted for a week. I mean, you gotta imagine that what they found probably was not like huge amounts or portions, so it wouldn't have been hard to go through that all really quickly, you know? Parado only ate a single chocolate-covered peanut in 3 days. Even with our strict rationing, the food supply dwindled quickly. There was no natural vegetation and no animals anywhere in sight for them to eat. When the food ran out, they tried to eat the cotton stuffing inside the seats and leather from belts and shoes, and they became ill. Knowing that rescue efforts had been called off and facing certain death from starvation, the survivors gave each other permission to use their bodies for food in case they died. Left with no alternative, the survivors consumed the bodies of their deceased friends and relatives. Canessa later described the decision to eat the dead. Our common goal was to survive, but what we lacked was food. We had long since run out of the meager pickings we'd found on the plain, and there was no vegetation or animal life to be found. After just a few days, we had the sensation that our own bodies were consuming themselves just to remain alive. Before long, we would become too weak to recover from starvation. We knew the answer, but the answer was just too terrifying to contemplate. The bodies of our friends and teammates, preserved outside in the snow and ice, contained the vital life preserving proteins that would keep us alive. But could we do it? For a long time, we agonized. I went out in the snow and prayed to God for guidance. Without his consent, I felt I would be violating the memory of my friends, that I would be stealing their souls. We wondered whether we were going mad to even contemplate such a deed. Had we turned into brute savages, or was this the only alternative for us to survive? Truly, we were pushing the limits of our fear. The group survived by eating the bodies of their dead comrades. This decision was not taken lightly, as most of the dead were classmates, close friends, or relatives. Sinessa cut the meat with a shard of broken windshield glass. He set the example by swallowing the first matchstick-sized lump of human flesh. Several others followed suit over the next few days, but a few still kept refusing to eat human flesh or just couldn't make themselves eat the life-saving protein. In his memoir, Parado wrote about this decision. At high altitude, the body's caloric needs are astronomical. We were seriously starving with no hope of finding food, but our hunger soon grew so voracious that we searched anyway. Again and again, we scoured the fuselage in search of crumbs and morsels. We tried to eat strips of leather torn from pieces of luggage, though we knew that the chemicals they'd been treated with would do us more harm than good. We ripped open seat cushions hoping to find straw, but found only inedible upholstery foam. Again and again, I came to the same conclusion. Unless we wanted to eat the clothes we were wearing, there was nothing here to eat but aluminum, plastic, ice, and rock. Parado protected the bodies of his mother and sister so they would not be eaten. They dried the meat from the bodies in the sun to make it easier to eat. At first, they were so disgusted by the experience that they could only eat skin, muscle, and fat. But when that ran out, they ate hearts, lungs, and even brains. All of the passengers were Roman Catholic. Some feared eating human flesh. I said Christian earlier. They were Catholic. Some feared eating human flesh would lead to eternal damnation. According to Reed, some survivors compare their cannibalism to the Eucharist, i.e. the conversion of bread and wine into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Others use the John 15:13 Bible verse to justify their cannibalism. No man hath greater love than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. In the end, all who survived the ordeal made the decision to eat human flesh, though not without serious reservations. Javier Methol and his wife Liliana, the only surviving female passenger, were the last to eat human flesh. Liliana had very strong religious convictions against doing so, and only reluctantly agreed to eat human flesh after someone suggested that doing so was akin to receiving Holy Communion. Close to midnight on October 29th, and 17 days after the crash, an avalanche struck the fuselage while the survivors were asleep. The avalanche almost completely filled the fuselage with snow and ice and smothered 8 people to death. Enrique Platerio, Liliana Methol, Gustavo Nikolic, Daniel Maspons, Juan Mendez, Diego Storm, Carlos Roque, and Marcelo Perez. The death of Perez, the team captain and a leader of the survivors, along with the loss of Liliana Methol, who had nursed many injured passengers like a mother and a saint, were particularly difficult to bear for the remaining survivors. The avalanche completely buried the fuselage. The survivors trapped inside quickly realized they would soon run out of air, so Parado took a metal pole from the luggage racks, pried open one of the cockpit windscreens and poked a hole through the snow for fresh air. On the morning of October 31st, they were able to dig an exit tunnel with considerable difficulty from the cockpit to the surface, only to be faced with a furious blizzard that made them crawl back into the fuselage. The blizzard raged furiously for 3 days, trapping the survivors together with the bodies of the deceased inside the snow-filled fuselage with only 1 meter of breathing space. On the third day, they began to eat the flesh of their newly deceased friends. Prado later said, "It was soft and greasy, streaked with blood and bits of wet cartilage. I gagged hard when I placed it in my mouth." With Perez dead, 3 men, Daniel Fernandez and cousins Eduardo and Fido Strzok, assumed the leadership of the group. They took over harvesting the flesh from the deceased and distributing it for others to eat. Before the avalanche, a few insisted that the only way to survive would be to climb over the mountains to search for help, because the co-pilot kept repeating that the aircraft had overflown Curacao before he died. The survivors believed the Chilean countryside was only a few kilometers due west. Alas, they were actually more than 55 miles to the east, deep in the Andes mountain range. As the days passed, the temperature rose with the advent of summer, and the snow that had buried the fuselage gradually melted away. In the first few weeks after the crash, some survivors set out on brief expeditions to explore the immediate vicinity of the aircraft, but they found that altitude sickness, dehydration, snow blindness, malnourishment, and the extreme nighttime cold made it impossible to travel any significant distance from the crash site. On November 15th, Arturo Noguera died, and 3 days later, Rafael Echeverrian also died, both from their infected wounds. Numa Turcotti, whose extreme revulsion against eating human flesh dramatically accelerated his physical decline, died on day 60, weighing only 55 pounds. The remaining survivors knew they would all die if they didn't leave to get help soon. The survivors heard on the transistor radio that the Uruguayan Air Force had resumed searching for them. Without any mountaineering gear at all, on December 12, 1972, Parado... Sorry, this is hard to do and talk at the same time. Parado, Sanessa, and Vizitin began climbing the glacier at an altitude of 3,500... let me go to feet, that's a little easier. 11,710 feet, aiming for the 15,320 foot western ridge of the glacier, blocking their way to the west. They managed to cross the ridge and then descended and trekked for over 10 days, traveling 38 miles to get help. Based on the aircraft's altimeter, they thought they were at 7,000 feet when they were actually at about 11,800 feet. Given the pilot's dying statement that they had overflown Curacao, they estimated they were near the western edge of the Andes, and therefore the closest help lay due west. As a result, they only brought along a 3-day supply of meat for the 3 of them. Parado wore pairs of jeans and 3 sweaters over a polo shirt. He wore 4 pairs of socks wrapped in a plastic shopping bag. They had no rock climbing gear, no map, no compass, and certainly no climbing experience. Instead of climbing the somewhat lower ridge to the south, they headed straight up the steep 60-degree slope of mountain to the peak. That was not a laugh. I'm sorry, I was struggling to breathe there for a second. They estimated they would reach the peak in only a day. Parado took the lead with the other 2, often asking him to slow down. The thin, oxygen-poor air made climbing difficult. During certain sections of the climb, they sank up to their hips in the summer-softened snow. Parado and Sanessa took 3... Oh, hold on, I skipped something. They realized their rescue-seeking expedition was going to take much longer than they had anticipated. They were running low on food, so Vizintin offered to return to base camp to save the food for the remaining 2 so they could complete their journey. Vizintin's return was entirely downhill, so he arrived back at the crash site in an hour by using an aircraft seat as a makeshift sleigh. Parado and Sanessa took 3 hours to climb to the summit. Sanessa thought we're dead when he reached the summit and saw the snow-capped mountains extending out in every direction as far as the eye could see. But Parado saw 2 lower peaks near the western horizon that were clear of snow, with the valley at the foot of their mountain winding its way towards those peaks. While on the summit, Parado told Sanessa, "We may be walking to our deaths, but I would rather walk to meet my death than wait for it to come to me." Sanessa agreed. "You and I are friends. We have been through so much. Now let's go die together." They followed the ridge towards the valley for a considerable distance as they descended. Parado and Sinessa hiked for 7 more days. Sinessa was exhausted and unable to keep walking, so they rested for the evening. As they gathered wood for a fire, they saw 3 men on horseback on the other side of the road. Parado called out to them, but the sound of the river's rushing snowmelt drowned out his voice. One of the men across the river saw Parado and Sinessa and shouted back, "Tomorrow." The next day, the man returned, scribbled a note, tied the note and a pencil to a stone, and threw the stone across the river to Parado. Parado replied, I come from an airplane that crashed in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have a wounded friend up there. In the plane, there are still 14 injured people. We need to get out of here quickly, and we don't know how to. We don't have any food. We are very weak. When are you going to come get us? Please, we can't even walk. Where are we? The story of the survivors' ordeal drew international attention from the media when the news broke that they had managed to survive 72 days on the mountain completely on their own after the flight had crashed. A crowd of international reporters hiked several kilometers from Puente Negro to Termas de Flaco. The reporters clamored to interview Parado and Sinessa about the crash and how they managed to survive. Normally, the search and rescue team would have also recovered the remains of the dead for burial. However, given the circumstances, including the fact that recovery would have to be made from Argentine soil, the Chilean rescuers left the bodies behind until Argentine authorities decided how to proceed. The Chilean military photographed the bodies and mapped the crash site before returning to Chile. The survivors had a press conference on December 28th at the Stella Maris College in Montevideo to tell the story of their 72-day ordeal. Alfredo Delgado acted as a spokesman for survivors. He compared their actions to that of Jesus at the Last Supper, during which he gave his disciples the Eucharist. The survivors initially faced a backlash of public opinion, but after they explained the pact the survivors had made amongst themselves to sacrifice their flesh in case of death to help the others survive, the outcry subsided and their families became more understanding. A Catholic priest heard the survivors' confessions and assured them they were not going to be damned for cannibalism, given the extreme nature of their survival situation. The news of their survival and the cannibalism they had to resort to drew worldwide attention and developed into a media circus. The Argentine authorities and the victims' families decided to bury the remains of the victims at the crash site in a common grave. 13 bodies were whole, while another 15 consisted only of skeletal remains. 12 men and a Chilean priest were transported to the crash site on January 18, 1973. Family members were not allowed to attend. They dug a grave 400 to 800 feet from the aircraft fuselage at a location they deemed protected from avalanches. The party doused the aircraft remains with gasoline and set fire to the wreckage. Eduardo Strock later mentioned in his book that the bottom half of the fuselage, covered in snow and thus spared by the fire, was still there when he returned in 1995. Ricardo Echeverrian, the father of one of the victims, received word from a survivor that his son had wished to be buried at home. Unable to obtain official permission from Argentine authorities to retrieve his son's body, Echeverrian hired guides and mounted an expedition of his own. He had arranged with the priest who had buried his son to mark the body bag with his son's remains. Upon returning to the abandoned Hotel Terramas El Sausalito, he was arrested for grave robbery. A federal judge and the local mayor interceded to secure his release, and Echeverrian was later authorized to make funeral arrangements for his son. So, here's a timeline. Day 0, October 12th, departed Montevideo, Uruguay. 45 people alive. Day 1, October 13th, departed Mendoza, Argentina, 2:18 p.m., crashed at 3:34 p.m., fell from aircraft, missing. Gaston Costamale, Alejo Huni, Guido Margari. Okay, you know what? I feel like really bad that I'm like not reading the last names right, so I'm just gonna go with first names. Joaquin, Ramon, Daniel, Carlos, Colonel Julio Cesar, Dr. Francisco Nicola, Esther Horta Perez, Eugenia Dolge, and Fernando Vasquez. They died in the crash or soon after. So at this time, 5 are dead, 7 are missing, 33 are alive. Died during the first night: Francisco Felipe Julio Dante, that was the co-pilot at LaGuardia, died on day 2. This was on day 2. Graziella. So now we're at 10 dead, 7 missing, 28 alive. Day 9, Susan Parado died. Now we have 11 dead, 7 missing, 27 alive. On day 12, they found dead bodies of Gaston, Eligio, Guido, Hoquan, and Ramon. Now we have 16 dead, 2 missing, 27 alive. Day 17, the avalanche killed Carlos, Daniel, Juan, Liliana, Gustavo, Marcelo, Enrique, and Diego. So 24 dead, 2 missing, 19 alive. Day 34, Arturo Noguero died. 25 dead, 2 missing, 18 alive. Day 37, Rafael died. 26, Rafael Egverian died. 26 alive, 26 dead, 2 missing, 17 alive. December 11th, Numa Turcati died. 27 dead, 2 missing, 16 alive. Day 61, Parado, Sinessa, and Van Zetten set off to find help. We're still at 27, 2, and 16. Day 62, they found the dead body of Daniel Shaw. So we are now at 28 dead, 1 missing, 16 alive. Found the dead body. Day 63, found dead body of Carlos Valletta. 29 dead, 0 missing, 16 alive. Parado and Sinessa encounter Sergio. So 29 dead, 16 alive. Parado and Sinessa rescued, still 29 and 16. 6 more people, Jose, Daniel, Jose, a second Jose, also known as Coche, Alvaro, Carlos, and Eduardo rescued. So 29, still 29 and 16. On day 72, 8 people were rescued. Alfredo, Roberto, Roy, Javier, Ramon, Adolfo, Antonio, and Gustavo. So final total, 29 dead, 16 survived. And this is of the 45 passengers that were on the plane, including all of the crew. The survivors' courage under life-threatening conditions has been described as a beacon of hope to their generation, showing what can be accomplished with persistence and determination in the presence of unsurpassable odds when we set our minds to attain a common goal. In 1973, the mothers of the 11 of the victims who died in the crash founded the Our Children Library in Uruguay to promote reading and teaching. Family members of victims of the doomed flight founded Fundación Vivin in 2006 to preserve the legacy of the flight, the memory of the victims, and to support organ donation. Every year, the crash site continues to attract hundreds of visitors from all over the world to pay tribute to the victims and survivors and to learn about how they managed to survive. The trip to the site takes 3 days. 4-wheel drive vehicles take visitors from the village of El Sausalito in Mendoza to Puesto Aria near the abandoned Hotel Termas El Sausalito. From there, travelers either continue on horseback or walk for 3 days to reach the crash site. They spend their first night in the Valley of Tears at the El Barrazo campsite, and on the 3rd day, they reach the Las Lagrimas Glacier and the crash site. In March 2006, the families of the victims of the crash built a black obelisk monument at the crash site to memorialize those who lived and died there. In 2007, while being interviewed on Chilean television, Sergio Catalan revealed he had arthrosis of the hip. Sinessa, who in between had become a doctor, and other survivors responded by raising the money needed to pay for his hip replacement surgery. Catalan died on February 11th, 2020 at the age of 91. And as far as I was able to find, she's the only survivor that is now dead. I don't know how old this article is. Usually they're pretty good about updating it, but yeah, if anybody has any information on whether or not any of the others died, let me know. As always, please don't do anything I wouldn't do. Be cautiously kind to others and make good choices. I'll see y'all next week. Thanks for hanging out with me. Bye.